They believed that they were selecting an easy target, a peaceful elderly man who was riding a bus. What were they unaware of? They would never forget the lessons he imparted, as a Vietnam veteran who had been battle-hardened. The 5:15 bus, which was en route to downtown Baltimore, was just another day. The atmosphere was oppressive, as commuters were anxious to return home. The occasional screech of brakes was interspersed with the gentle buzzing of conversations. An elderly black man sat down in a seat near the front. His hands, which were rugged and weathered, were perched atop a cane that appeared to have as many years on it as he did. His attire was straightforward, a well-worn jacket and neatly pressed trousers, indicative of an individual who prioritized dignity over flash. At first, he was not given much attention by anyone. He was the type of individual who you would briefly observe and then promptly forget, as he seamlessly integrated into the everyday environment. However, his posture conveyed a profoundly different message. He maintained an upright posture and maintained an unwavering gaze, as if the weight of the universe could not sway him. However, the slightest furrow in his brow suggested that his life had been marked by turmoil. A group of adolescents boarded the train 3 seats back, their laughter being both sharp and boisterous. They walked with the carefree swagger of youth, perusing the bus for their next source of entertainment. The old man was observed by a lanky youth who was wearing a bright red hoodie. His eyes were not illuminated with respect, rather, they were illuminated with malice. He whispered something to his companions, which elicited a chorus of snickers. He gently nudged them. The individual remained seated, gazing out the window as the city streets whizzed by. He failed to make any indication if he detected their murmurs. However, the lads were not content with mere whispers, they desired a response. "Hey, old man," the boy in red called out, his voice piercing the bus's hum. "Have you misplaced your walker? I bet you are anticipating someone to assist you in getting home, right?" The bus was shook by a wave of tension. A few passengers noticed the lads, while others observed the man. Although the majority maintained their heads down, they pretended not to hear. The elderly man's gaze was fixed on the world beyond the glass, and he adjusted slightly in his seat but did not speak. Red Hoodie smirked, feeling confident in the absence of opposition. He stood up, slightly swaying as the bus encountered a jolt. "What is the matter, Grandpa? Your tongue has been bitten by a cat." The man's expression remained composed, despite the fact that his fingers tightened, imperceptibly, around the cane. He caught a fleeting glimpse of something, perhaps patience, in his gaze. He slowly turned his head, just enough to meet the boy's gaze. And during that brief instant, something changed. There was no dread or anger in his expression, rather, it was a quiet, unyielding strength that appeared to calm the atmosphere. The youth hesitated for a brief moment, but his pride prevented him from stopping at this moment. The passengers were mute and tense as the bus continued to rattle down the road, as if they were anticipating an event. They were unaware that the elderly man's silence was not a sign of weakness, rather, it was a deliberate decision. A decision that would substantially alter the course of events. The adolescents' laughter intensified, reverberating off the bus's walls in an attempt to attract attention. The youth in the red hoodie approached with a mocking tone in his voice. He jeered, "What's the matter, old man? Are you too good to talk to us?" His friends laughed. One of them, a stocky teen who was wearing a backward cap, joined in. "It is likely that you are unable to hear us. Do you also require a hearing aid?" The elderly man remained seated, his cane now securely resting between his legs. His expression was devoid of emotion, and there was no indication that the insults had penetrated his composed exterior. However, his hands, which were calloused and steady, tightened ever so slightly around the worn wood. He glanced momentarily at the floor, as if to re-establish himself in the present moment. Sitting across the aisle, a young woman shifted uneasily in her seat. She glanced at the adolescents with caution, but she promptly returned her focus to her phone. A man in a gray suit adjusted his tie and buried his snout deeper into a newspaper, his discomfort evident. No one was interested in participating. The silence was met with a smirk from the youngster in the red hoodie. He turned to his companions and said, "Look at him. He likely believes that he is too superior to us. Are you a king or something?" Another youngster concurred, "Yes. Are you going to knight us with that cane, Grandpa?" Their voices were tinged with the recklessness of youth, and the barbs were sharp. They increased their laughter in response to the man's reticence and the passenger's refusal to intervene. The elderly man's head tilted slightly, as if he were observing a distant memory that was only visible to him. Red Hoodie's tone was now bordering on irritation as he demanded, "Speak. Or are you frightened?" The bus abruptly halted at a red light, temporarily muting the conversation. The elderly man finally articulated his thoughts, his tone being both hushed and authoritative. Respect is a lesson that some individuals only learn the hard way. The words were straightforward, yet they were significant. They were undeniably weighty and suspended in the air. The adolescents briefly exchanged glances, uncertain about how to respond. However, Red Hoodie promptly recovered, concealing his anxiety with a sense of confidence. He exclaimed, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "Oh, so he talks now. Respect, huh? That's quite a statement from an individual who is too timid to advocate for himself." The elderly man's gaze met the boy's as he turned his head slightly. "You believe that strength is audible, don't you? You are unaware of the physical appearance of strength." Every passenger was now fully invested in the unfolding drama, as the bus fell into a tense silence. Even the boy's companions appeared uncertain, as their laughter transitioned into nervous grins. The bus jerked forward as the light turned green, causing its occupants to sway. Red Hoodie approached the fellow with a mocking air of intimidation, leaning over him. "Why don't you demonstrate your strength?" The elderly man exhaled slowly and deeply, as if to prepare himself for the impending events. He glanced at the boy with a serene, inscrutable expression that seemed to be unyielding. The child was not the only one who was about to receive an education. An event that would remain indelible in the minds of all passengers on that bus was imminent. For a brief period, the bus appeared to contract, the tension being so intense that it exerted a pressure on all passengers. The elderly man maintained his composure, his cane securely in his grasp. His eyes remained fixed, however, in the subsequent silence. His thoughts wandered unintentionally to a different era, 40 years ago. He had been in the humid marshes of Vietnam, standing knee-deep, far from Baltimore. The sharp, staccato bursts of gunfire and the deafening rumble of helicopters filled the air. Every nerve was on edge, and every muscle in his body was rigid. Survival was not an option, it was an imperative. He was scarcely older than a boy at the time, and he was younger than the children who were currently taunting him. However, the conflict had rapidly accelerated his aging. He recalled the expressions of his brothers in arms, who had supported him during those unfathomable moments. Some were no longer with us, their memories surviving in fragments, such as the sound of their mirth during quiet nights in camp or the manner in which they would recount stories of their home. He had carried the weight of their loss for an extended period following the conclusion of the conflict, and their sacrifices were deeply ingrained in his being. He was abruptly startled back to the present when a bus struck a pothole. His grasp on the cane tightened as he slightly straightened. He was not incensed. He was no longer able to generate anger effortlessly. He perceived a responsibility to impart a lesson to these lads that they had evidently not yet acquired, a responsibility that was more profound and nuanced. Red Hoodie interrupted his contemplation with a sharp, mocking chuckle. "Grandpa, what is the matter? Has the cat once again bitten your tongue?" The man did not respond. Instead, his gaze swept over the boy, observing the posture, arrogance, and false confidence that accompanied his lack of understanding of the gravity of genuine challenges. He had observed it previously in youthful soldiers who believed they were invincible until the battlefield proved them wrong. An older woman crossed the aisle and whispered to the man sitting next to her, her eyes darting nervously toward the spectacle that was unfolding. There was no one who spoke up. No one intervened. The silence was not entirely fearful, rather, it was a tacit agreement to refrain from becoming involved. The man's voice was composed and deliberate when he eventually spoke. The youngster was halted in mid-laugh as he said, "You remind me of someone I used to know." Red Hoodie attempted to maintain an air of indifference, uttering, "Oh yeah? Who is that? Is it your former wartime companion?" The individual inclined his head slightly. His gaze was unwavering. "No. A young soldier who believed himself to be untouchable." He acquired an alternative perspective. The boy snorted, but his companions were noticeably quieter now, their smirks faltering. "It's irrelevant, sir. You are merely an elderly individual who has achieved nothing. No one is interested in your anecdotes." The man's lips curled into the slightest suggestion of a smile, not out of amusement, but recognition. "Be cautious, son. Occasionally, narratives are the sole means by which you can prevent yourself from repeating the same errors." The words lingered in the air, and for a brief period, the bus appeared to resonate more gently. However, Red Hoodie was unwilling to concede. Stepping closer, he was now only centimeters away from the elderly man. "You believe you are so intelligent, don't you? Why don't you demonstrate it?" The elderly man's eyes narrowed slightly, not out of wrath, but rather in anticipation. He adjusted his cane, his movements deliberate and sluggish, as if he were a man who was fully aware of his actions. The old man's internally brewing storm was not the result of wrath, rather, it was shaped by his life experiences. It was about to demonstrate the significance of strength to these lads. The occupants were ensnared in the tension that permeated the bus as it chugged along. The elderly man gradually rose from his seat, relying on his cane to maintain his balance as he stood. He was not a large man, age had diminished the bulk of his frame. However, the manner in which he conducted himself gave the impression that he was taller and stronger. The lads observed him, and their smirks dissipated as their curiosity intensified. The man's voice was tranquil and almost silent, yet it managed to capture the attention of everyone on board. "You wish me to demonstrate something?" he inquired. His gaze was fixed on the red hoodie, unyielding. "Permit us to discuss the subject of proof." Red hoodie took a half step back as he hesitantly chuckled. "Are you going to strike me with that cane, old man?" The cane was not lifted, despite the fact that the man's palm briefly touched the top of it. "No," he replied uncomplicatedly. "However, I will impart a lesson to you. It is evident that your mouth has not yet acquired the ability to control its language." The air was charged with an energy that caused a sensation of prickling at the back of your neck. The other passengers observed with wide-eyed curiosity, with some leaning forward as if to ensure that they did not miss a single word. The man continued, gesturing at the lads, "Do you believe this is strength? Posturing? Loud words and attempting to embarrass someone in public? It is not strength, it is fear. Fear that the world will perceive you for who you truly are." The boy's companion's confidence was visibly ebbing, as they shifted uncomfortably. He muttered, "Come on, man. Let's just sit down." However, Red Hoodie was unwilling to relinquish it. He was unable to compromise in front of his crew, as his pride was at stake. "You are unaware of my existence, old man," he replied, although his voice was devoid of its previous intensity. The man responded, "I am more knowledgeable than you believe," his voice remaining composed and steady. "Do you see this cane? It is more than just a stick, it is a reminder. Each scar and ache in these aged bones has a narrative. Tales of battles waged with courage, discipline, and honor, rather than with fists. Things that are beyond your comprehension due to the fact that you have never been required to earn them." The boy's confidence was shaken, and his hands were clenched into fists, but he remained seated. The elderly man's gaze was piercing, and he leaned in slightly. "Are you aware of the experience of witnessing the death of your friends in order to ensure your own survival? To carry their memory with you every day, knowing that you owe them more than you can ever repay?" The words struck with a force that was greater than any punch. The boy's jaw clenched, as if he intended to speak, but no words emerged. The bus was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of its motor. The other passengers, captivated by the scene, were unable to catch their breath. The man continued, "You are fortunate, young man, you do not have to learn these lessons the hard way." His tone softened slightly. "However, if you persist in this manner, disrespecting others and believing that the world owes you something, you will soon discover the truth. And when that day arrives, you will regret not having heeded." His companions avoided the old man's gaze, their previous laughter now a distant memory. The boy's face turned red, not from anger, but from shame. He looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. The driver of the bus peered in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed, but his hands remained firmly on the wheel. No one else moved, and the silence was deafening, interrupted only by the sound of the bus gliding down the road. The old man's posture was as unyielding as ever as he straightened. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "take your seat, or get off this bus." Red Hoodie hesitated for a moment, then silently muttered something before returning to his seat. His companions followed, their heads bowed and their bravado shattered. The confrontation was over, but the lesson had only just begun. And it wasn't just the boys who had something to reflect on. The tension on the bus began to subside as the adolescents sank into their seats, but the silence persisted. Passengers exchanged quiet glances, some with approval, others with disbelief. The elderly man stood for a short period, his grip on the cane firm yet relaxed. His gaze briefly swept over the bus, settling on each passenger before he slowly returned to his seat. Finally, a middle-aged woman seated near the front of the room broke the silence. "Sir," she said, her voice hesitant but respectful, "that was brave." Her words were a combination of remorse and admiration, as if she regretted not speaking up sooner. The man gently tilted his head, giving her a slight nod. "It was not bravery," he replied, "it was simply the right thing to do." The boy looked out the window with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his voice low and subdued. His friends whispered among themselves, their voices low and subdued. It was evident that they had been shaken, not just by the man's words, but by the realization that their actions had consequences beyond a quick laugh. Behind him, Red Hoodie and his friends were unusually quiet. The bus continued to move forward, its engine emitting a gentle murmur. A young man, who was seated near the rear and was wearing headphones around his neck, raised his voice. "Vietnam, correct?" he inquired, his demeanor apprehensive yet inquisitive. His expression was inscrutable as he turned slightly. "Yes," he replied simply. The young man continued, "My grandfather served there. He never spoke about it much, but when he did..." His voice drifted off, and he looked down at his hands. "Thank you, for what you did. For the gift you have given." The elderly man's lips curled into a faint smile. "We all contributed to the cause," he stated. "Some of us more than others." The words lingered in the air, laden with significance. A number of passengers quietly nodded, as the gravity of his statement began to sink in. The bus's atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Previously, there had been tension, now, there was reflection, a collective comprehension of the gravity of the event they had just witnessed. The stocky youth with the backward cap cleared his throat in an awkward manner. "Sir," he said, his voice scarcely distinguishable from a whisper. "I apologize. We should not have expressed those sentiments." The man's expression softened slightly as he turned to gaze at him. "I accept your apology," he stated. "However, it is important to remember that respect is not something that is granted solely in response to a request. It is something that you donate because it is the proper thing to do." The boy nodded rapidly, his face flushing. Red Hoodie did not respond, but he shifted uneasily, evidently grappling with his thoughts. The elderly man glanced out the window, his eyes momentarily scanning the familiar street corner. He tapped his cane once on the floor, then rose to his feet. Before he exited, he turned to face the bus, his voice carrying over the hum of the engine. The bus slowed as it approached the next stop. "Kindness and respect are free," he stated, addressing no one in particular but speaking to all. "However, they can be costly to withhold." The man stepped out as the door hissed open, his stride remaining steady and his presence remaining long after his departure. As the bus departed from the curb, passengers were absorbed in their own thoughts, as the bus remained silent. They had witnessed a lesson in dignity, rather than a confrontation, and for some, that lesson would endure beyond the duration of the bus voyage. The atmosphere of contemplation persisted as the bus continued to move. The idle chatter that had previously occupied the space was now reduced to whispers or complete silence. For many passengers on that journey, the old man's words resonated more loudly than any sound they had heard all day. Red Hoodie's posture, which was once bold, had become deflated as he sat slumped in his seat. His companions refrained from making eye contact with one another, their expressions a combination of embarrassment and guilt. A young woman who had previously maintained silence across the aisle now gazed out the window, her reflection indistinct in the glass. She had been a bystander, like so many others, but she now questioned why she had not taken more action. The young man in the back, who had previously discussed his grandfather, leaned his head back and closed his eyes, lost in contemplation. The middle-aged woman in the front took out her phone but did not use it, her fingers brushing over the screen absent-mindedly. It was not merely a moment for the adolescents, it was a call to action for all. The lesson was not solely about respecting elders, it was also about acknowledging the significance of an individual's voyage, the battles they waged, and the fortitude required to navigate life with quiet dignity. The bus's final stop was reached, and passengers began to disembark, each taking the moment with them in their own unique manner. The group of teenagers exited together, but they continued to walk apart, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a serene introspection. Red Hoodie hesitated at the corner, returning his gaze to the bus, before placing his hands in his pockets and departing. The silence spoke volumes to the passengers who remained. They had witnessed a straightforward truth, delivered with unwavering resolve: respect is not acquired through intimidation or terror, rather, it is acquired through compassion and comprehension. To those who are viewing this narrative, contemplate the battles that the individuals in your vicinity have waged. How can a single act of compassion or respect transform an individual's day, or even their life? Please bear in mind that each individual you encounter has a story that you may never be privy to. It is important to treat them with the respect they deserve. And if you found this story to be meaningful, please remember to share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to receive additional stories that serve as a reminder of the values that are truly important. By working together, we can disseminate these lessons and establish a more compassionate, empathetic world.